The lonely mansion. The winter night had grown heavy over the sprawling city, but in the far corner of its quiet, wealthier district stood a mansion so large and silent that it seemed less like a home and more like a forgotten monument. The lights from its tall windows shone faintly into the dark, but the glow felt cold rather than warm, as though the house itself had no life within it. Inside that mansion, sitting near a window that overlooked acres of untouched snow, was a man named Charles Whitmore. For many in the city, the name Charles still carried weight. He was once one of the richest and most influential men the state had ever seen. Business journals had praised his empire, politicians had sought his presence at galas, and charities had fought for his donations. Yet to those who knew him now, he was simply a man in a wheelchair, a man who no longer walked, no longer laughed, and barely even spoke unless he absolutely had to. Charles had been paralyzed for nearly 20 years after a brutal accident that broke more than just his bones. It broke his spirit, his belief in people, and eventually his marriage, his friendships, and even his bond with his own family. The wheelchair that carried him from room to room was not only a machine of necessity, but a symbol of everything he had lost. Each time its wheels turned, they reminded him of the legs he would never again use. The once powerful figure who had commanded boardrooms and inspired fear in rivals now felt like a prisoner locked inside his own estate, surrounded by riches that brought no comfort. On nights like this, when the snowstorm pressed against the glass and the wind sang through the cracks of the grand old house, Charles often wondered whether his life held any meaning at all. He had grown accustomed to silence. Servants had come and gone, most leaving because they could not bear the weight of his bitterness. The mansion had once required an army of staff to keep it running smoothly, but now only 1 or 2 employees visited during the day to clean or bring him groceries. At night, he was completely alone. The large living room, decorated with expensive paintings, grand carpets, and furniture fit for kings, seemed like a stage waiting for actors who never arrived. The laughter of friends and family had long since vanished, replaced by an emptiness so profound it felt like another living presence, a ghost that trailed him everywhere. On this night, Charles sat near the fireplace, though the fire had long died down into a dull glow. He wore a heavy robe, though the chill in his heart was colder than anything outside. His eyes drifted to the window, watching as flakes of snow tumbled endlessly through the air, covering his estate in white. The world looked so peaceful beyond, the glass so pure, but inside him there was nothing but shadows. He reached for the glass of brandy on the table beside him, letting the bitter liquid burn down his throat. He wondered, as he often did, if this was all life would ever be, a slow crawl toward the end with nothing left to fight for. Then, cutting through the silence, came a sound he had not heard in years at this hour, a knock. It was faint, cautious, but it echoed down the empty hallway like a bell in a cathedral. Charles froze. His first thought was that he had imagined it, another cruel trick of his lonely mind. But then it came again, 3 soft taps against the servant's side door, a door no one had approached in over a decade. For a moment he considered ignoring it. Whoever it was, whatever it was, had no place in his life. Yet something inside him stirred, a mixture of curiosity and unease. Slowly he gripped the wheels of his chair and guided himself through the darkened corridors of his mansion. The long hallway stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of ancestors he had never cared for. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, judgmental and cold. The wheels of his chair creaked against the wooden floor, a sound that filled the silence. When he finally reached the door, his heart was pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. Carefully he unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. The icy wind rushed in immediately, carrying snowflakes that stung against his face. And there, framed by the yellow porch light, stood a girl no older than 7. She was small, almost fragile against the storm. Her skin glistened with snow, her hair tangled and dusted white, her shoes worn so thin that her toes peeked out. She hugged her coat tightly, though the fabric was so torn it barely offered protection. Her eyes, however, told another story. They were wide, bright, and filled with something Charles had not seen in a long time, Hope. She looked up at him, shivering but unafraid, and spoke in a voice that was soft yet steady. "Sir," she said, "I'm really hungry. Do you have any leftovers?" Charles blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had been approached many times in the past by people asking for money, for favors, for opportunities. They always carried some hidden agenda, some desire to gain from his wealth. But this was different. This was a child, standing alone in the middle of a snowstorm, asking not for money or gifts, but simply for leftovers. The innocence of her request cut through him like a blade. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The girl continued, her voice trembling, but still filled with that strange certainty. "If you give me your leftovers, I can give you a miracle. I can help you walk again." For a long moment, Charles simply stared at her. Then, against his own will, a laugh escaped his lips. It was not a laugh of joy, but of disbelief, almost bitter. The sound startled even him, for he had not laughed in years. "You?" he asked, his voice edged with mockery. "You can help me walk again? Little girl, do you have any idea who I am, what I've been through? Doctors couldn't fix me, money couldn't fix me, faith couldn't fix me. And now you stand here promising miracles in exchange for scraps of food?" The girl didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her small fists clenched at her sides as the snow fell harder around her. "My mama says love can do things that money can't," she replied firmly. "If you're kind to me, I can give you that miracle. You'll see." Charles wanted to close the door right there. He wanted to send her away and retreat back into the comfort of his emptiness. But something in her eyes stopped him. There was no deceit in them, no greed, just a strange, unshakable faith. He sighed deeply, feeling both exhausted and strangely moved. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice quieter, "before you freeze to death." The girl stepped inside, her tiny frame dwarfed by the towering hallway. She looked around in awe at the chandeliers, the paintings, the rugs that seemed like they belonged in museums. But unlike others who had entered his mansion in the past, she showed no envy, only wonder. She followed him into the kitchen, where he opened the refrigerator and found a plate of untouched food from earlier. He set it before her, and she accepted it with gratitude, but instead of devouring it immediately, she looked back up at him. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Now may I help you?" Charles frowned, confused. "Help me? You've got your food, little one. That's all you asked for." The girl shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, a promise is a promise. You gave me kindness. Now I must give you your miracle." She placed the fork down gently, then walked to his wheelchair. She laid her small hand on his knee, her palm warm even through the thin fabric of his trousers. For the first time in 20 years, Charles felt something he could not explain. A warmth that spread through his leg, not a physical healing, but a stirring, a flicker of sensation deep within his soul. He stared at her, unable to speak. "My name is Amara," she whispered softly. "And you will walk again, Mr. Charles. You just have to believe." The words lingered in the air long after she spoke them. Charles, the man who had abandoned faith, long ago sat frozen in place, torn between disbelief and the tiniest spark of hope he thought had died forever. The challenge of faith. The days that followed were unlike anything Charles Whitmore had experienced in years. For 2 decades, his mornings had begun the same way. Lonely breakfasts, long hours staring at books he could no longer bring himself to read, endless reflections on everything he had lost. But now, as the snow continued to blanket the city, he found himself waiting for the soft knock on the servant's door, waiting for the little figure wrapped in a worn coat, waiting for the sound of her bright, unwavering voice. Amara came almost every day, sometimes with another wilted flower, sometimes with nothing more than a smile, and each time she brought with her a piece of warmth that seemed to chip away at the frost that had settled around his heart. Yet not everyone in his world welcomed this new presence. Mrs. Green grew increasingly vocal in her disapproval. One evening as she prepared dinner, she confronted him more sternly than before. "Mr. Whitmore, forgive my bluntness, But this child is becoming a habit, and habits can be dangerous. It begins with food, then it becomes gifts, then it becomes money. You may not see it yet, but people like her mother, struggling with 3 jobs, will see opportunity here. I have seen it before. Poverty breeds desperation. Charles stiffened at her words. In the past, he might have agreed. He had once lived in constant suspicion, certain that everyone who came near him had an ulterior motive. But now, when he remembered Amara's clear eyes and the way she spoke of miracles without hesitation, he could not reconcile her with the greed Mrs. Green warned him of. "She's not like that," he replied, his voice firmer than usual. "She doesn't ask for money, not even for herself. She only asks for food when she's hungry, and even then, she thanks me with more sincerity than anyone I've ever known." Mrs. Green shook her head. "You are blinded, sir, and that is what worries me. Hope is dangerous when placed in the wrong hands." That night, Charles lay awake thinking about those words. Was he being foolish, letting a child plant ideas of miracles in his mind? Was he setting himself up for another heartbreak? He had built his entire life on skepticism after the accident, convincing himself that to expect nothing was the safest way to live. Yet Amara had come into his life like a spark in the dark, daring him to hope again. It was terrifying, and, yet in some strange way, thrilling. The next afternoon, Amara arrived earlier than usual. She was holding a small notebook, its cover frayed and corners bent. She placed it on the table in front of him with a kind of pride. "This is my miracle book," she explained. "Whenever I see something kind or beautiful, I write it down. Mama says if you fill your book with good things will start happening to you." Charles lifted the little book with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with uneven handwriting, simple sentences written with the sincerity of a child. "The neighbor gave Mama bread when she worked late. A lady on the bus smiled at me today. I found a coin on the street, and it was shiny like the sun." Each entry was so ordinary yet so powerful in its simplicity. "You really believe this?" he asked, his voice caught between wonder and doubt. "Yes," Amara answered without hesitation. "Because when you notice the little miracles, you make space for bigger ones. You don't have to start with walking, Mr. Charles. Start with seeing. Then the rest will come." He stared at her, the words echoing in his mind. Start with seeing. Had he been so blind all these years that he missed the small kindnesses life still offered? His fortune, his mansion, his possessions, all of it, had seemed meaningless because he looked only at what he had lost. Yet here was a child teaching him to see through another lens. Not long after, word of Amara's visit spread beyond the mansion. The neighbors, who had long resented Charles for his aloofness, whispered about the strange friendship between the wealthy recluse and the little girl from the poor block. Some accused Amara's mother of sending her intentionally, hoping to charm the old millionaire into financial help. Others warned that the girl would break his heart when her family's needs grew too great. Charles heard these murmurs from Mrs. Green, who repeated them with disapproval in her tone. When he asked Amara about it one day, she smiled calmly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of pain. "People will always say things, Mr. Charles, but my mama doesn't even know I come here most days. She's too tired. I come because I want to. Because you need me as much as I need you." The word struck him harder than he expected. He had always believed himself to be beyond needing anyone. His pride had been a fortress, a shield against further disappointment. But hearing those words, spoken with such childlike honesty, made something inside him crumble. He realized she was right. He did need her. Not because she could truly heal his legs, but because she was healing something deeper, something he had forgotten how to feel. Connection. And yet, the greatest challenge to his newfound hope came from within himself. That week, while Amara placed her hand gently on his knee once more, sending that strange warmth coursing through him, he felt a sudden surge of anger. What if it was all a lie he was telling himself? What if he let her convince him, only to wake one morning with the same dead weight in his legs, crushed by disappointment all over again? The fear of hope was worse than the comfort of despair. Stop, he snapped suddenly, pulling his chair back. Amara looked up at him, startled. Don't do this, he continued, his voice trembling with both rage and fear. Don't fill my head with fantasies. I've been broken for 20 years. Nothing will change that. Not you, not your miracles, not your book. For a moment, Amara's lips quivered, her eyes welling with tears. But then she straightened her small shoulders and said quietly, Miracles don't work if you don't believe in them. I can't carry all the believing by myself. You have to help me. Her courage, her refusal to back down, silenced him. He turned his face away, ashamed of the bitterness that still lived in him. She didn't speak again that evening, but before she left, she placed the little notebook back on the table. Keep it, she whispered. Maybe one day you'll write in it too. When she was gone, Charles stared at the notebook for hours, his heart heavy with conflict. He wanted to throw it into the fire, to reject the fragile hope it represented. But instead, he kept it close, his hand brushing over its worn cover as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. That night, he dreamed for the first time in years. In the dream, he was walking through the snow, his legs strong beneath him, Amara's laughter echoing in the distance. He awoke with tears on his face, unsure whether they came from joy or grief, perhaps both. And so, the challenge had begun. Not just against the doubts of others, not just against the prejudice of his housekeeper or the whispers of neighbors, but against himself. For the first time in 2 decades, Charles Whitmore stood at the edge of a battle far greater than any business, deal, or personal struggle he had ever faced. The battle to believe again, the awakening. The first signs of change came quietly, almost hidden, like the earliest rays of dawn that slip over the horizon before the world realizes morning has arrived. Charles Whitmore, a man who had once lived in the shadow of bitterness and despair, began to notice things again. At first, they were little things, things most people might ignore. The way sunlight broke through the frost on his windows and spilled golden light across the floor. The sound of sparrows chirping in the trees beyond his iron gates. The faint smell of wood smoke drifting from the poorer apartments across the street. These were details that had always been there, but for years he had been blind to them. Now, with Amara's small notebook resting on the table beside him, he found himself paying attention. Every day Amara returned, sometimes with her hair still damp from the snow, sometimes with a new flower hidden in her pocket, sometimes with only her wide, determined eyes. She continued her strange ritual of laying her tiny hand on his leg, speaking words of encouragement with the sincerity of someone who had no doubt at all. Charles still struggled to believe, but he no longer mocked her. Instead, he allowed her to try, and each time, though he felt no true physical healing, he felt that strange warmth spread through him. It was less about the leg itself and more about the part of him that had long been frozen, the heart. Mrs. Green continued to warn him, her voice sharp with suspicion, but Charles found himself listening less and less to her doubts. The woman had been his servant for decades, loyal and diligent, but she carried the same weary prejudice he had once believed himself. She saw danger in everything, betrayal in every corner. Yet when Charles looked at Amara, he saw no such shadows. She had nothing to gain from him, no reason to visit so faithfully, and yet she came. Her presence was like a candle in a dark room. It didn't erase the shadows, but it reminded him that light was possible. One afternoon, when the snow had melted enough to reveal patches of brown earth, Amara appeared with her cheeks flushed and her hands dirty. "Come outside, Mr. Charles," she said brightly. "I want to show you something." Charles hesitated. He rarely left the safety of his mansion anymore, preferring to hide within its walls. But the sparkle in her eyes disarmed him, and so with effort he wheeled himself out onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was fresh, bracing, alive. He had not felt the sky above him in weeks. Amara guided him down the stone steps, her small hands gripping the side of his wheelchair as though she could pull him forward with sheer determination. She led him to the far edge of the yard where the snow had thinned to reveal a small patch of soil near the fence. There, planted carefully in the ground, was the wilted flower she had given him days before. Its petals were still weak, but it stood upright, stubborn against the cold. "I planted it," she said proudly. "Because even something small can grow strong if you give it care. Just like you, Mr. Charles. You are not broken, you are planted. You just need time to grow again." Charles stared at the fragile stem, his throat tightening. No one had spoken to him like that in years. To the world, he had been broken, discarded, forgotten. But this child saw him as something that could still bloom. For the first time in decades, he felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He turned away quickly, not wanting her to see, but Amara noticed anyway. She touched his arm softly. "It's okay to cry. Mama says tears are proof that the heart is still alive." That night, when Charles returned to his study, he opened Amara's notebook and for the first time added his own words. His handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the sentence was clear. "Today I went outside and saw a flower still standing in the cold. It made me believe maybe I can stand too." When he closed the notebook, he felt lighter, as though a chain had loosened around his chest. But awakening is never simple, and doubt still lingered like a shadow. One evening, after Amara had left, Charles stared at his reflection in the tall mirror by the hall. He saw the man he had become, gray hair, lined face, slouched posture in the wheelchair. He remembered the man he once was, powerful, admired, commanding, and the contrast filled him with bitterness. Could he truly believe that life still held more for him? Could he really hope for a miracle when logic and experience told him otherwise? Was then that he felt a sudden urge he hadn't experienced in years, the urge to try. He locked his wheelchair brakes, placed his trembling hands on the armrests, and strained with every ounce of strength in his upper body. For a moment his legs responded with nothing but dead weight. His chest burned, sweat rolled down his forehead, and frustration roared inside him. But then, so faintly he wondered if he imagined it, he felt a flicker, a twitch in his thigh, a spark that had been absent for 2 decades. He collapsed back into his chair, gasping, his heart pounding wildly. It could have been nothing, a phantom sensation, a cruel trick of his mind. And yet he could not deny what he felt. Trembling, he reached for the notebook and wrote a single line. "I felt something tonight." The next day, when Amara arrived, he told her what had happened. Her face lit up with triumph. "See? I told you the miracle was coming. But you have to keep trying. Don't give up now. The miracle needs your help too." Her confidence was contagious. Charles began to allow himself small experiments. Each night after the house was quiet, he would test his strength. Sometimes he felt nothing. Sometimes he felt that faint flicker again, so small it could almost be dismissed. But each time, he recorded it in the notebook. Slowly, the pages filled with sentences that traced his progress. Not physical healing yet, but a transformation of spirit. One evening, as he and Amara sat by the fireplace, she asked him a question that startled him. "Mr. Charles, what will you do when you can walk again?" The words pierced him. He had never dared to think that far. His life had become so entangled in despair that he had stopped imagining possibilities. He sat in silence for a long while before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've lived so long in this chair that I can't picture anything else." Amara leaned closer, her eyes shining. "Then start picturing it now. Because miracles need a dream to grow into. If you walk again but have no dream, then what's the point? You have to decide who you want to be when the miracle comes." Her wisdom, spoken with the clarity of a child, struck deeper than the advice of any doctor or counselor he had ever known. That night he dreamed not just of walking but of living, visiting places he had long abandoned, standing at the gates of his business empire, meeting his estranged mother with dignity instead of shame. For the first time, his dreams were not about what he had lost, but about what he could still have. The awakening had begun. Not the sudden miracle of healed legs, but the gradual miracle of a man rediscovering life, rediscovering hope, rediscovering himself. And as Amara had promised, it all started not with walking, but with seeing. The miracle and the legacy The winter slowly gave way to spring, and as the snow melted into streams that ran down the stone paths of the Whitmore estate, so too did the ice in Charles's heart begin to thaw. For the first time in many years, he looked forward to the mornings. The silence of the mansion, once unbearable, now felt like the calm before a bright arrival. He would sit by the window, waiting to see a small figure skip across the street, her curls bouncing in the breeze, her little hands clutching either a flower, a piece of paper, or sometimes nothing at all. Amara no longer needed to bring anything tangible, because her presence itself had become the gift that carried him through each day. But now, with the season changing, Charles felt a new kind of pressure building inside him. The small sensations he had begun to feel in his legs were growing stronger. At first it was just a faint twitch. Then it became a tremor when he tried to shift. And one night, when he braced himself against the arms of his wheelchair, he managed to lift his body a few inches before collapsing again. It wasn't walking, not even close, but it was more than he had managed in 2 decades. His hands shook when he wrote the words into the little notebook. "I stood for 3 seconds tonight." He stared at that sentence for a long time, hardly believing it was real. When he told Amara, her entire face lit up with joy. She clapped her small hands together and said, "I knew it. I knew it would happen. But you see, Mr. Charles, the miracle didn't come only from me. It came because you started believing. You helped it grow." Her words filled him with pride, but also with fear. The more progress he made, the more terrified he became of failing. What if his legs betrayed him again? What if this fragile hope shattered like glass, leaving him worse off than before? The battle inside him was fierce, but Amara refused to let him surrender. Every time he doubted, she reminded him of the flower she had planted in the cold soil. "Remember," she said, "it didn't bloom in a day, but it still bloomed because it never gave up." Weeks turned into months, and Charles began to train himself secretly. When the mansion was quiet, he would lock the doors of his study and push himself to the limit. He gripped the edge of his desk, sweat pouring down his face, forcing his legs to remember what his mind screamed they could not do. At first his attempts ended in failure, but gradually he discovered strength he thought was gone forever. Each small victory, a twitch, a shift, a moment of balance, he wrote into the notebook until the pages became a diary of resurrection. The night everything changed was quiet, warm, and filled with the smell of spring. Amara had left earlier that evening, leaving behind a drawing she had made of him standing upright, smiling with the sun behind him. He had laughed at it at first, but as he stared at the picture later, something ignited inside him. He wheeled himself to the center of the room, locked the chair, and pressed his hands hard against the armrests. With a grunt that tore from deep within him, he pushed upward. His legs trembled violently, threatening to give way, but this time, they held. He was standing. For a moment, his mind could not comprehend what his body was doing. He looked down at his feet, planted firmly on the floor, and a sob escaped his chest. Tears streamed down his face as he clung to the chair for balance, his entire body shaking not from weakness but from the overwhelming flood of emotion. He was standing. After 20 years, he was standing. The next day, when Amara arrived, he didn't tell her immediately. He wanted to show her. He waited until she had finished her small ritual of placing her hand on his leg and speaking words of encouragement. Then, with a determined breath, he gripped the armrests and pushed himself up again. Slowly, shakily, but undeniably, he rose to his feet. Amara gasped, her little hands flying to her mouth. Then she burst into tears of joy, running forward to hug him tightly around the waist. "I told you," she cried, her voice trembling with triumph. "I told you the miracle would come." Charles held her close, his tears mingling with hers. "You were right," he whispered. "But it wasn't just the miracle of walking, Amara. It was the miracle of living again. You gave me back more than my legs. You gave me back my heart." The weeks that followed were filled with transformation. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that the old millionaire was walking again. At first, people dismissed it as rumor, But when Charles walked slowly but firmly to the gates of his mansion one morning, the onlookers were stunned. Neighbors who had once whispered resentfully about him now stood in awe. Some even wept, for they knew what it meant to witness such a change. Charles didn't retreat from the world this time. Instead, he embraced it. He reconnected with his estranged mother, who, upon seeing her son stand before her after 20 years, broke down in tears and clutched him as if she would never let go. He began reaching out to his old business partners, not to rebuild his empire, but to redirect his fortune. The mansion that had once been a monument to his loneliness became the center of something new, a foundation dedicated to helping children, like Amara, children whose lives were marked by poverty but whose spirits carried unshakable hope. And at the center of it all was Amara. She and her mother were no longer struggling to survive in the cold apartment across the street. Charles ensured they had a safe, warm home, but more than that, he gave them family. To the world, she was the little girl who inspired a miracle. To him, she was the daughter of the heart he never knew he needed. Years later, when people asked Charles what had restored his ability to walk, he never credited medicine, nor wealth, nor determination alone. He always answered the same way. It was a miracle born from kindness. A child asked me for leftovers, and in return she gave me back my life. Never underestimate the power of hope, love, and faith, even when it comes from the smallest hands. And Amara, whenever she told the story, would smile and add, "He thought he was giving me food, but really I was giving him back to himself." The mansion that had once stood as a fortress of loneliness became a house of laughter, filled with the sound of children playing, families gathering, and lives being changed. The flower Amara had planted by the fence grew strong, its roots deep in the soil, blooming brighter with each passing year. And just like that flower, Charles and Amara's bond stood as living proof that miracles were not only possible, they were inevitable when hearts chose to believe.